The video you are about to watch is from an old woodworking magazine that I published during the years of 2003 to approximately 2006. This was a very unique magazine. It was purely video content and it was distributed on DVDs. The magazine ran for approximately 3.5 years, and then due to financial concerns, we simply had to terminate the magazine. We moved on to other things over the last roughly 15 years. However, there has been a request to resurrect this content, so I've gone through the trouble to get the equipment, the products, everything I needed in order to bring this content back to life to share with everyone. Here on this YouTube channel, we'll be putting up approximately 100 to 120 of the original stories that appeared in that magazine. The magazine was called Woodworking at Home Magazine, and it was truly one of a kind in the world. I really hope you enjoy these videos, and please tell your friends about them. For a closer look in this issue, we're going to take a look at how you go about preparing your stock from rough sawn lumber into usable lumber that you can further mill into making your cabinets and so forth. Now, of course, all of your material selection starts out at the sawmill when you're picking out your lumber. You want to sight down the face and the edges to find straight, flat lumber. You don't want to buy pre-planed lumber if possible. If the material is already pre-planed to 3/4 of an inch thick, you have no material left on there to remove to flatten out the board. Most importantly, take a moisture meter with you when you're buying your stock. Now that'll allow you to go through and measure the moisture content throughout your lumber. You want to buy all of your material with a similar moisture content. Don't mix and match with a wide variety, 2 or 3 or even 4 percentage points of difference in moisture content, because that can create further problems months down the road after assembly. So go through and check out your boards very carefully to make sure that your moisture content is fairly consistent across all of the boards and within one board. Now, more often than not, a warped or twisted board can simply be just a matter of too much moisture in one area or the other on a board. If you let it acclimate in your shop for a couple of weeks, then check your moisture content to see if it's evened out. Now you can go ahead and start processing it. But if you've got wide variations in moisture content, flattening out the stock at this point will probably result in a warped piece of material a few weeks down the road. One of the more challenging issues to deal with is twisted lumber. Now in this case, this wide board has a high spot here and here, which allows us to rock it in this fashion. This larger timber, or longer timber, has the same problem, but much worse. Now we'll start out by addressing that issue first. Now many woodworkers, they went out and picked themselves up a surface or a thickness planer and felt that, gee, I can just take this board and run it through the planer and that will flatten it out. We're going to clearly demonstrate that that is not the case with this particular board. And again, notice the amount of rock that we're starting with. So what we'll do is we'll run it through the planer on one face, get that cleaned up, flip it over, run the other face through and get that cleaned up, and see how bad the board is still warped. Now as you can see, the board has been planed smooth on both faces. Nice and smooth. However, we still have the same twist in the board as when we started. So now we've got to figure out how we can get away from that. And it's really quite simple. You just have to perform another step before the thickness planing operation. Now what we have to do is go through and remove the high spots on this board, and that would be these 2 points right now. Remove those so that the board would sit relatively flat, so when we pass it through the planer, we're registering off of a flat surface instead of a twisted surface. And there's a couple of different ways you can go about that. It'll start out with some handwork. Now we will talk about the joiner in a moment, but on a board this wide, which it's 11 inches wide, it probably won't fit on your jointer. So what I'm going to do is show you how you can go about getting the high spots off of this board using some basic hand tools. Now the first tool would be a bench plane or a scrub plane. And what you could do is plane off the high spots. It's a relatively slow process, but if you've got a good plane, you can remove a lot of material pretty quick. The next possibility is a belt sander with a very coarse grit belt on it. And that'll be very fast, very aggressive. And you just work it over on the high spots. The fastest method is to use a powered hand planer. Very aggressive tool, removes a lot of material quickly, and what you can do is just rub down or grind down, so to speak, the high spots and get those out of the way so that the board's relatively flat to begin with. So we'll quickly demonstrate each of those steps. To help make sure that I'm keeping everything straight and flat, I'm going to use a straight edge or a known straight edge. In this case, it's just a simple board of MDF. And what I can do, I can look at both ends here, and I can see I'm high in the middle, but low on each end. So I'm going to make some marks in this center area because I know I need to remove material there. And I'll do the same, working my way all the way across the width of the board. Still high in the middle, and high in the middle. So now what I'll do is I'll focus my effort here in the middle area. Now with the surface relatively flat, I want to double check by sighting down two boards that I've placed on top of the board that we're working with. And these are called winding sticks. And the way it would work, you'll sight down one board onto the top surface of the one behind it. And that way you'll see if they're twisted this way or this way at all. And then you can work up along the surface, marking up any areas where you know you need to remove out a little bit more material. Well, it took a little bit of planing, but we've got it now flat on the surface. Now, of course, that's just one surface that's flat. The other one is still very warped. So now what we can do is we can place that flat surface down on the table for our thickness planer and start running it through the planer until we bring the top surface into flatness. And there we have it, a nice flat board. Now the one thing that you have to keep in mind when either hand planing or running through your thickness planer like that, the final thickness of the board is dictated by how much warp or twist or cup is in the rough stock. You have to remove all the high spots to get a flat surface before you can move any further. So even though you bought 1 inch thick stock, you may not be able to get 3/4 inch thick finished material out of it. It may be warped or twisted just too much. So we'll move on to the next demonstration, and that's to work with a little bit narrower stock. Now again, this board was 11 inches wide, and my jointer is only a 6-inch jointer, so we had to do most of this flattening by hand. This particular jointer's got a 6-inch cutter head on it, so it can take a 6-inch cut width. So any board that's 6 inches or narrower, I can face plane on my jointer. Now one attribute I like about a jointer is a long bed. This bed is 42 inches long, and that's at the very bare minimum for length. Unless you're just doing small little work where you're working with boards, say 3 feet or less, you can get by with one of those benchtop jointers. However, for most casework and cabinet work, you do want a nice long bed jointer. Now the technique that I use for jointing or face planing my boards, I'm not, as in the case with edge joining, we're always worried about keeping our board flat against the fence. Well, when you're face planing, you're not worried about that. But what you are worried about is once this board advances past the cutter head, we want to make sure that this end of the board stays flat against the outfeed table, because now we've got a qualified surface on our material, and we're going to be using the qualified surface on the jointer, and that's your outfeed table. So what I'm going to do, I'll lower my infeed table down to about 1/8 of an inch. I've got a fairly warped and twisted board here, and I'll take several passes. And now each time I take a pass, I'm going to make sure I maintain good pressure on the board, keeping it flat against that outfeed table. Now at this point you can see I've removed most of the twist. This was the high spot in this area here, and this was the high spot down at this end of the board. And I've got most of the surface cleaned up, but I think I'll take one more pass across it so I've got a little more stable of a surface when we pass it through the thickness planer. As you can see, I've got most of the surface planed off, and I've got about 70–80% cleanup on it, and that should be adequate to run it through on the thickness planer. And of course, we'll put the flat surface down, and we'll start by cleaning up the top surface and getting that good and cleaned up. Then we'll flip it over and run it to thickness on this side. After the planing operation, you should have a nice flat board. Now before we move on to the next step in stock preparation, let's take a look at one more condition on another piece of wood. And this one is a cupped board. It's cupped like this. Now it does lay very flat on my workbench, so it's cupped very evenly along its length. Now the way I would handle this board is I would take that concave surface and place that down against my jointer table and then pass it over my jointer, thereby flattening out this surface a little bit more. Then I could move on to the planer. Now let's go back to that board we just did. Now oftentimes you're going to get a board that isn't cut straight along one edge. Now you could head over to the jointer and start nibbling away at all this, but you're going to spend an awful lot of time trying to remove these high spots in these areas. Rather, I've got a little bit faster way of getting you close to a straight edge, and then we can go to a joiner and make it one pass usually. Now here's our sample piece with that huge curve in it. And of course we have to remove most of this material in order to get it straight. And that could take a long time at the jointer. So to speed up the operation, what I like to do is take a board or a straight edge of some sort, something that I know is good and straight, and then I'll just lay that across the edge that I need to joint, and I'll draw a pencil line along there. Now that gives you an idea how much material we're going to need to remove. And that's a lot, almost an inch in this case. So I'm just going to head over to the bandsaw and bandsaw along that straight line. Now if you don't have a bandsaw, you could of course use a circular saw. Now that we've taken and bandsawn that edge nice and straight, one pass over the jointer should do the trick. Now when jointing the edges, you want to make sure that you keep your board flat against the fence as we pass it over the cutter head. And that's all the way through and on out the other side. If you allow that board to come away from the fence, instead of having a square edge, you're going to of course have a beveled edge. So it's very important to keep it flat against the fence. And then once we get to the outfeed table side, we want to make sure that our freshly cut edge stays down tight against that outfeed table. There is another important aspect to planing and jointing the edges of a board, and that's paying attention to the grain pattern. Now we'll take you over by each tool and I'll show you how this grain pattern affects the cutting operation. Over here at the jointer, you want to feed in the direction where the peaks of your grain pattern are pointing. Here you can see where I've penciled them in, and this is the direction we should be feeding. Now keep in mind that that cutter head is spinning in this direction, or pushing back towards you. Now as it's pushing, it wants to push the material back up against itself. If we were to reverse this and feed the board through in this direction, it's going to want to try and peel the layers of wood off of the board. And that, of course, isn't a real good situation. So always try and feed with the grain. Now here at the planer the cutter head is going to be spinning in this fashion. So if we were to feed the peaks in first, it's going to want to try and lift the layers of wood apart, and that would cause terrible tear out. So when feeding through on your planer, you want the peaks pointing towards you at the infeed end. So that would cause the cutter head to push the layers of wood back down rather than trying to peel them apart. So the feed direction is the opposite for a planer as it is for the jointer. Now, of course, having nice straight stock that's also flat and of the appropriate thickness is important for quality craftsmanship. However, there's a very important safety issue as well that we should look at, and that has to do with twisted boards, as well as even cupped or warped boards. And it has to do with when we're doing ripping operations. Now, of course, I've got the table saw unplugged as I'm showing you this. But as I feed this board through, you'll notice that it's sitting relatively flat, and we can get a pretty good rip on it at this point. But as I feed further and further through, now my natural tendency, of course, is to push down as I'm feeding in. Now watch as what happens as I'm pushing down here. Now notice this end is lifting up. Now as I get further and further into that cut, this end comes up higher. Now if we take that board and we tilt it up, it gets closer to the blade, or actually it gets pushed away from the fence. And right about here, guess what's going to happen? We're going to bind up between the back edge of the board and the back edge of the blade. And that's going to cause kickback, causing this board to come right back at me at about 100 miles an hour. So having flat stock also is a very important safety consideration. Well, I hope our little explanation on stock preparation enlightened you a little bit. Now, it seems like a very basic operation, but it is very important not only to quality, but also to safety. Thanks for watching. I'm Chris DeHut.
I sincerely hope you enjoyed watching this video. If you truly enjoyed it, please help us share this information with the rest of the communities. Please hit the subscribe button, give us a big thumbs up, and be sure to tell your friends about this channel. Thanks again for watching.